in the 20s and 30s, and when the mines were mechanized and jobs just kind of dried up, my family moved to Boston.
Right.
In search of opportunity, in search of just a chance for us, and honestly, really fleeing the racial terror in their town. So
Right.
the KKK was really active, and so our family knew it was time to get up out of there and just look for something new. So my family gets to Boston in the 1950s and gradually makes their way to Common Square. And so
Right.
19 Aspinwall Road, which is like 3 streets from here,
Right.
is where a tiny baby Carolyn came into the world. And so again, this is home, and so it's really beautiful to be here with y'all because this is where it began. And so for me, my story is not that different from so many kids growing up in the city, just sort of running around, growing up. And I think what's phenomenal and terrible about Boston is the fact that we have so many incredible institutions, cultural institutions,
Right.
educational institutions, world class, so they say. But as a neighborhood kid, you can definitely grow up here feeling totally disconnected to all
Right.
these places and all these things, as if it's in another planet. And that was my experience. And it wasn't until much later where a guy who was working at City Year, actually, and had been a dean at Northeastern and a dean at Dartmouth. His name was Greg Ricks.
Greg. Yeah, I remember Greg.
Greg Ricks, a legend, right?
Oh, yeah.
So he took a bunch of us who were Reach Scholars at the Freedom House. I'm a Reach Scholar, and it was an incredible program for young people from the neighborhoods who were just trying to go to school.
Right.
And Reach was like, well, you can go to school and that's great, but you know what? We want to make sure you guys know your history. We want to make sure you know how important these investments that we're making in you are, so that you can come and give back to the neighborhood.
Right.
So Greg came in and took us all on a walking tour, amazingly, of Roxbury, of the South End, and told us about all the organizing and activist history. Folks like Mel King and Chuck Turner took us to Wally's, told us a story there, told us about urban renewal,
Right.
told us about all these things that I had never heard of.
Right.
Growing up in this city, it's very easy to feel locked out, particularly as a black child.
Right.
It's really easy to feel like the city is not for you.
Right.
It's exclusive, and you just need to go to Atlanta quick. You just need to go to New York quick. You just need to
Right.
go to the West Coast quick.
And you always hear that, right?
You always
I'm
hear
gonna
that.
go down south.
I'm
Right,
out.
Right.
So that day with Greg was phenomenal because it was the first time that I realized that so many black and brown people and working class people had fought hard for so many of us to have a city that offers us more.
Right.
We need more, but there was so much fight and so much organizing, and I know you all know that because you
Oh,
are
yeah.
organizers right here. I'm in the nest.
That's right.
Who knows that it has to be the fact that without fighting, there is no progress. Without resistance, there is no progress. Without struggle, there is no progress. And so those stories were taught to me probably when I was maybe 19 or so, and a huge light bulb went off in my head and in my heart.
Right.
And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, all these people have been organizing and fighting for us, stopping highways, stopping urban renewal, fighting for Tent City, for Via Victoria, for all these stories that are our legacy,
Right.
that are our true wealth. And so it turned into me asking a lot of questions because I had never heard those stories before Greg told them to me. And I started talking to my family members, my grandmother, my aunt, my uncle, saying, is this true? Did this really happen? Was this really this place called Christmas Barbecue in the South End? What was this
Right.
place called Slaves? Like, what happened? And they would start telling me stories. And by the end of, I don't know, I want to say, Reverend Ron, like a month or so, I had this notebook full of stories from my family, not only verifying these things that I heard, but telling me so many other things.
So you was keeping track, like
Keeping
writing a journal. Wow.
Yeah, and then I said, you know what? This is ridiculous. I've been growing up in the city, born and raised right here, almost 20 years old, and all I thought about the city was something negative. All I thought about the city was there's too much violence, there's too much crime, it's too racist, it's John Hancock, it's Paul Revere. That's not for me. I gotta go. And so what that did is it turned my heart around, and I came up with this idea to let that be the heart of young people's experience growing up here. What if it could be young people who could learn about the stories of their own families, how their families get to Boston, learn about the story of how their neighborhoods were created and who created them, the organizing strategy, what was going on in the streets, and how that could be a part of a job. And so
Right.
that's literally how my town was created by me and a college buddy, Denise Thomas, who was just really concerned about the state of young people and trying to reconnect us to our history and stories.
So was all these folks the same age? Were you all 20, 19?
We were 22, so this
Okay.
was my first job when we started my
I
town.
remember that.
Yeah,
Wow.
a long time.
That's
a
a
long
long time,
ago.
right,
I'm
right.
an old lady now, so
I remember that.
it's true. And so for about 8 years, that was my job every day. Which
So you was giving tours?
we were giving tours. We
Wow.
hired high school students from the Boston Public Schools,
Right.
and some Metco students too. So they were 14 to 18 years old, and each day they would be responsible for talking to family members, talking to their neighbors, going to the archives, doing research, and turning
Them
those
young people were
stories.
smart.
Were they powerful?
They were
Very
powerful.
powerful.
Right.
They would turn those stories into 90-minute walking tours, and we
Right.
sold those directly to the public. And so it was a source of revenue
Right.
for the organization.
Right.
And what we didn't know is that we were really putting a pressure point on the way that Boston presents itself and tells its own history.
Mm-hmm.
And so these young people, they took over.
Right.
And we're so proud because that was more than 30 years ago
At
now.
least, yeah.
And now we have so many young people who have come out of that program, including our state senator, Liz Miranda,
Liz, right?
including our citywide counselor, Ruzi Lugine. And so lots of folks, and we have lots of folks who have families, who are working in the city, who are all over the country. Who
Isn't
are
that
doing
a
big
good
things.
feeling?
It's an unbelievable feeling, only
Yeah.
because it was a group of young people realizing that we can believe in ourselves.
Right.
And that our families and our stories are powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And by owning those stories and owning our city, we can show the level of investment that we can make ourselves.
Right.
And that can bring other resources and other attention, which is what happened. And so the young people really turned my town into something truly special. They won lots of awards that really didn't have a lot to do with me, because I was often in the office just banging on a keyboard.
Right.
But they were out there
They were
doing
out
the
there.
work. They
They were
won a
definitely,
White
yeah.
House commendation
Right.
as one of the best humanities programs in
Right.
the country, one of
Wow.
10. So again, a tribute to our young people, how powerful they are, and how important it is to know our stories,
Mm-hmm.
to know how valuable they are, and to know how transformative they are for us, and also for the people that come into a city like Boston and think they know it.
Right.
Because the story is so much deeper,
It is so-
richer, and wider than many of us could even imagine, certainly myself.
Yeah, and the power story. Let's talk about people highways, people before highways.
Yes.
It's awesome.
Thank
You know, I hear a lot about this. I got to read this.
Yeah, you got
Because
to.
I'm listening to you now. That's truly the Boston story.
It's true.
You know, so
It's
how
true.
did you go about this? Was that the story you kept a journal leading to this?
It's funny you asked that, and thank you for shouting out the book. So, People Before Highways, shout out to UMass Press. This book came out now in 2018, so it's been around for a little bit. And it really did grow out of our experiences on the My Town tours. And so,
Okay.
as I mentioned, these were youth-led tours that would go through mostly the South End, into Roxbury a little bit, and then the young people wound up doing tours all over the city, which was also very powerful.
Right.
But for our tours in the South End, when we would walk basically 10 to 12 different stops through the neighborhood, it was always interesting to see how the young people would tell the stories of each stop. And
Right.
typically, young folks talk about how powerful it felt for them to be in a position of authority and expertise, and to
Yeah.
have adults get quiet
Right.
and listen to them. And so that was always notable to me, what that moment of just authority, pride, and stewardship was like for our young folks.
Right.
But usually in the South End, once we got to the Southwest Corridor Park or the Orange Line, the tour would typically flip. So if a young person, when the young person was giving a tour stop, if there were adults who were on the tour that had lived in Boston or were residents, at the moment of that tour stop, they would start telling the story of the Southwest Corridor Park, or start telling the story of the highway fight.
Okay.
And over this happened. And it really was notable to me, because it signaled a bigger story that people felt very connected to, very proud of. And I always was like, what is it about this highway fight that has people so passionate, so captivated, so much in an ownership moment that they're going to take over the tour
Right.
and they're going to tell the story. But it was always a positive thing, and we'd always learn something from something people told us. And so when I finally left my town, which was not easy, but when I finally left, I went to grad school, and I had a chance to just write a little bit about the anti-highway fight in a seminar class.
Right.
And I would write about it, and I was very interested. And then I wrote another paper about it, and then it just seemed like layers of an onion. And so that's how it began. It really began by realizing that this was an important story to the city and the region, and that people felt very proud of it. And then once I started to talk to people a little bit more, I realized that while we're proud of this story, few of us know what really happened.
Right.
And so that seemed like an opportunity because, in progressive fights, and certainly progressive land fights, there's so few victories. We fight all the time, and
All
we
the
should,
time.
but you don't fight to win.
Right.
You fight because it's right.
It's right.
And when you fight and you win, it's extraordinary.
Right.
So this story is a victory story, but the challenge was we didn't really know what happened. So I said, wait a minute, it's great,
Right.
we have a story, but it's not okay
Right.
if we don't have the playbook, because it might not be a highway coming, it might be something else coming, but we need to know how they won. And so that was my invitation. And so I essentially spent about 5 years actually interviewing people. I interviewed 50 different people for this book. I looked into a bunch of institutional archives around the city, probably 12 archives. I did oral history to really try to reclaim not only the fight to stop the road, but the fight to create a new possibility for what should take the place for what was going to be I-95 in the inner belt. And so by talking to people in their homes, in their kitchens, in their living rooms, by going through archival letters and notes,
That's
and
organizing.
photographs,
Wow, right?
it allowed me to offer this book, which is really telling the story of not only how people came together to fight I-95, but more interestingly, in some ways to me, how so many movements, Reverend Ron, were really cross-fertilizing at this time.
Right.
So you have the civil rights movement, you have the anti-war movement fighting the war in Vietnam, you have the women's movement, the student movements, and you have many young people, because these were lots of young people in the 60s and their 20s, who were working across several movements at once. And so what I came to realize through my interviews was that many people were connected. They were
Right.
friends working to demonstrate in Washington or demonstrate on their campuses or going to Selma for voting rights actions. And they were sharing strategies.
Right.
And they were sharing ideas throughout the 60s. So when it came to this 1968 moment, this 1968-69 moment of coming together to stop the highway, a lot of those relationships were actually coalescing, and a lot of people were bringing the experience and the strategies around mobilization, around direct action, around communications to bear, and it actually strengthened this particular movement because it was later, and it strengthened it because all of those social relationships were so strong.
Right.
So that was an incredible aha moment for me to see the ways that movements grow and move across time through
Right.
through multiple movements.
And in
through
particular during that
relationships.
time.
Yes.
That's the same year King came here. Right? The
Yes.
segregation.
He came earlier, yes.
Right.
Yes, because
Wow.
so and then King's assassination
Right.
actually in April 1968
68,
becomes a
right.
flashpoint
Okay.
for people actually decided to go harder on so many things. So there were underground organizations, including the Black United Front, where Chuck Turner was co-chair there. These were organizations that had been meeting, talking for years, right?
Right.
And then when Dr. King is assassinated, that becomes a moment of reckoning, but also a moment where a younger generation of activists decided that, you know what, we don't know if this racial integration thing is for us.
Right.
We don't know if this nonviolent civil disobedience thing is for us. We need more direct action. We need more a more forceful kind of politics and a stronger Black radicalism. And so you have the rise of a very strong current of Black nationalism in Boston. You have the rise of and the strengthening of the Boston chapter of the Black Panther Party right here.
Right here.
And moving an agenda in the aftermath of Dr. King's death that would really coalesce in many ways in the anti-highway fight itself. And so for me, that became a very powerful story about Black self-determination, Black nationalism, the ideas of community control, the ideas of not only thinking about integration, but more importantly, thinking about self-determination, again, in a future strategy that, again, a younger generation of folks who were saying, you know what, we don't just want to ask for permission to sit at a lunch counter.
Right.
We don't just want to ask for permission to have access to the polls. We want to not only think about space, we want to control space, we want to plan for space, and we want to mobilize that way.
Right.
A powerful, powerful set of lessons and a very different kind of political take for Black people at this time that would have phenomenal repercussions, not only for the Black community, but for the country as a whole.
Right.
So these were fights happening all over the country. Boston was not the only place that was experiencing highway growth. And Boston was certainly not the only place that experienced a very powerful backlash to that kind of growth. And so when we think about land use change, whether it's through urban renewal or Negro clearance, as Baldwin called it, or we're talking about highway expansion, we're talking about the ways that federal policy
Right.
and federal dollars are reorganizing space. And oftentimes what I found in my research is those dramatic and micro levels of reorganization of space come with deep, deep political repercussions and often organizing. So if you're going to take my house,
Right.
or if you're going to take my kid's school, no. Right? I'm going to organize. I'm going to have something to say about that. And if you keep doing that by in 1964, in 1963, by 1969, you're going to have a powerful wall of resistance. And that's exactly what we experienced here.
Right.
So when we think about the rise of grassroots organizing in politics, in the neighborhoods and at the street level, outside of government, it has to be often understood as a response to what's happening, but also the desire to elevate our conversation to figure out what can be next. How can we do better, and how can we take control of a process that is not working in our interest,
Right.
and is unfortunately working in our name because it's often coming from the government. And so that's a very important thing to think about in this moment of 1960s mobilizing, because sometimes it's really easy to think of, the civil rights movement is over here, or the student movement is over there, the environmental movement is over here.
Right.
But it's all happening in this cauldron of deep physical change of the land that we're sitting on. And so we're still fighting for land. We're still fighting for access to adequate and affordable housing. We're still fighting for good jobs. We're still fighting for quality education. Many of the things that generation in 1960 said, we can do better, we must do better, we can't wait for anyone else, it has to be us.
Right. So I'm thinking when you talk about this land and you talk about space, and I get the flash of South End. It hurt me so bad to see a nice building in the Harriet Tubman House. That is just like a sore spot. What's your feeling about that?
Very difficult. I
Yeah.
think in the South End in particular, you have such an incredible turnover in terms of the explosive growth in the valuation of homes and the valuation of that entire neighborhood, a neighborhood that for so long had been the forefront of organizing and resistance to that kind of speculative growth.
Right.
And so the Harriet Tubman House is a very heartbreaking story for so many of us, because the beautiful building that had been there, designed by David Lee,
Right.
Stellan Lee, showing us what it can look like to have a community center that is really for us, a
For us.
multi-service agency that really serves young people, older folks. And the reality is there's got to be more fight, and there's got to be more investment in terms of protecting the legacy of these institutions that are for communities that don't own.
Right.
And so if we decide that the city is truly for people who can own and buy everything, then we actually have lost the fight.
Right.
Because Boston is bigger than that. our communities who have been here for a long, long time deserve better and deserve more opportunity to be able to stay for generations and to be able to live out their lives. And so those stories are hard,
Right.
and they really force us to rethink how we're classifying land, how it is being developed, how we can think about development in a way that is not only more equitable, but is more has a more long-term vision. And so
Right.
this is definitely a call out for how we invest in these institutions, but also what is our citywide plan and strategy for
Right.
commercial and housing development overall. And so this is a moment of deeper reckoning there because we have too many losses on us.
Right. So that just takes us right into the big word, the buzzword, equity, wealth. What is that? I mean, you hear about it,
Right.
we talk about it, and, I don't know if folks really want to, there's like no answer, right? Or there is an answer.
There is an answer. We just need to grab hold of one. I can offer one.
Okay.
Yeah. So as you know, I've had a couple of times in city government.
Right.
Lucky for me, I have survived, but it was amazing. And most recently, I served as the chief of equity for the city, appointed by Mayor Walsh in 2020, right in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, when so many cities were really forced, often by advocates, by constituents, and leaders were trying to respond to figure out what else could city government do
Right.
to respond to a demand for more justice, a demand for a more clear-sighted vision on racial equity, and certainly an intersectional approach to equity. So it was race for sure, but thinking about gender, thinking about religion, thinking about physical and cognitive abilities, all these things. What equity is demanding is that we take a look at outcomes. And so equity is about a corrective action, understanding that everyone has not had the same history, that there have been barriers and discriminatory actions that have held back particular populations. Equity is about recognizing that history and offering a very serious and intentional corrective so that people can land in the same place. It's
Right.
about wellness and well-being on the output point. Equity is not equality.
Right.
So equality is about giving everybody the same thing up front. And for communities that have had barriers, discrimination, and very, very specific structural impediments, giving everyone the same thing is a problem.
Right.
We want to treat everyone well, but we have to recognize that everyone has not received the same benefits, the same policies, the same level of investment from government or anyone else. And we, as government in particular, government has to look itself in the mirror and understand what it's doing to address these issues. And so 2020 was a moment
Right.
for many of us around the country and around the world, because it was a time where people were on the streets pouring out, whether it's through the movement for Black Lives, demonstrations and actions demanding not only police reform, and certainly we still need that, but also demanding a much broader understanding of the way that government has fallen short. These are conversations that we've had now these are not new conversations, but they take us all the way back to things like redlining,
Right.
to things like urban renewal, to all of these very destructive actions, to things like unequal health care,
Right.
unequal access to good housing. Those things are still burdens, are still pains, are still causing harms to our community. And so equity demands that we reckon again with that kind of history and think about particular interventions that will bring redress. So that is a big answer,
Right.
but I also teach a course on equity. So as you know, I'm a professor at MIT, right? And so I'm in the planning department, and one of the courses I teach, the course I'm teaching right now, is a seminar that is really looking at the way that mayors around the country are not only defining equity, but are delivering on equity based on very particular strategies. And so it can be defined.
Right.
It can be done, and it must be.
Have you noticed it seems like the movement is fizzling. When George Floyd, when that incident happened, it was protests, police.
The largest public demonstration in the history of the country.
Right? But now it seems as if back to business as usual.
I would say it depends on for whom you mean, right? For many of us, it is not business as usual,
Right, for us, right.
And others. And
Right.
so the question is, what kind of an appetite do we have to maintain pressure and maintain focus? Because I think too many times we kind of throw up our hands and say there's nothing we can do because it's not in the media cycle. It's not something that's top of mind for people. When I say something, I mean equity. I mean driving for justice in a particular way. And I know that when I was appointed as a chief of equity, I came in the office maybe 2 days later, and I felt so much urgency and so much concern because there was a moment of people in the streets. There was a moment of people in the government sector and in the corporate world saying, we got to do more. What can we do? What's the action?
Right.
And so that made it feel, and it was very clear that not only was it urgent, but that we don't have all day for this.
Right.
So I'm actually surprised that we are still having a conversation, and I'm heartened, but we have to act more swiftly because we can already see so much of the backlash on the ground. We can see the backlash in Congress. We can see the black backlash in Florida, all these places where people are actually trying to get us to take our eyes off the prize, which we cannot do.
Right. We're going to take some calls right now. Caller, you're live on Boston Black News.
Peace. Good morning. This is Jamal Crawford calling. How y'all doing?
Brother
Good, man.
Jamal, how are you?
Very well, very well. So I had to call in because, Ron, you got one of my favorite people.
Oh,
there
Of
my
course.
goodness.
All right.
And the reason she's one of my favorite people, because, I have a pretty easy standard. I'm real easy to figure out. First of all, I like smart people, right? And she checks that box.
That's right.
Secondly, I like clean people, like clean with a clean spirit. You know what I mean? No funny business, not trying to get over on nobody, not, a good person. And she's a solid woman. As long as I've known her, and I've known her for a long time, she's just been, we say a stand-up guy. That's a stand-up woman.
All right.
Right? And one of the smartest sisters we got in the city and the region.
Jamal, my head might explode. Be
no.
careful. Be careful.
Oh no, and I'll add that too. And she's also very humble because if most people was as bad as her, they would be walking around with a tattoo on their forehead. I'm bad. You know what I mean? She got the education. She got the whole situation. I'm a super fan. So that's number one. And then the conversation you were having, I'm loving it because, it takes it to a depth where, a lot of people don't do this level of, analysis on these things. So I want to add to that. 1968, as you know, was a critical year. And yes, the assassination of King did a lot of things. I want to mention one thing locally it did. That was also the year that Mamleo was formed.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So even the black police was like, all right, enough of this.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that was that. And also, too, one of my favorites and some of my elders who I was just with this past week, the Last Poets also formed in 1968 as a result and brought that same spirit of revolution and whatnot to the music world and the entertainment world.
Yep.
All right, so on to the point now of the revolution, because, Ron, you actually brought it up while I was calling, and you were saying the movement has kind of fizzled out.
Right.
Here's what I would say, and I'll try to do as succinctly as I can. Some of the things that Dr. Crockett was just talking about, like, in the later years, the Black Lives Matter movement, people such as myself who are not a fan of what that became and what it was, I saw that as a direct, like, watering down of the movement, almost a purposeful thing. Because when black nationalism was the rise, we had a strong foundation from black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. That's the reason that anybody is, quote-unquote, woke today, is because of all that stuff that was happening in the 60s and laying that foundation, Afrocentrics and black nationalism, all this type of stuff. We've strayed away from the original gospel. And then, in my view, when Black Lives Matter came, it was more of the rah-rah shish boom bah, the protests, but it was very light on principle. There were people out there who were protesting, didn't even know like what they were doing, as in the Black Panthers and other groups like that. When they got together, they had a foundational thing. We got a 10-point platform. We all agree on this. We're putting out, letters to the United Nations and to our states and this type of thing. And I didn't see that level of discipline, foundational grounding in a particular mindset or philosophy that kind of brought them all together. And I believe that that's why we have some of the problems that we've experienced with it, with the individualism, the running off the money and all that, da-da-da-da. So I'll shut up there and just say, if you could give me any of the things that you might have noticed between the movements from the 60s, the black nationalist stuff, and then the move that we've now experienced and gone into Black Lives Matter, which they themselves, on their website, they themselves decry black nationalism, and they look at that as, what do they call it, a patriarchal structure or whatever, but black nationalism is bad in their view. So I just like your thoughts on that.
Sure. No, and Brother Jamal, thanks so much for calling in, for all of your accolades, but also for your insight and your question. So, we have such a long tradition in the black radical tradition of resistance and redefinition. And what I would say is it is imperative that each generation define and name for itself its goals in form of movement making. So what we do know of black nationalism is there is a critique that's there that many people would stand behind. And the question of the fight for land, for me, is the central issue here. And even for black nationalists to kind of figure out what does it mean to be people fighting for land in a landless condition is the sightline for me. And figuring out how is it that our claims for space, claims for land and territory can be recentered in our conversation, because what I do feel like is in the last 50 years or so, we've definitely stood back from those claims. So more than a critique about a particular movement or its formation, my concern is the ways that the discussion of space and land is missing from our discussion of radical black politics. And it's notable to me because I had the benefit of actually traveling to Colombia in November, and to the Pacific coast of Colombia, which is the second most populous black region of the country. And you have a community of black and indigenous people who are talking very much about international trade, who are talking very much about how to defeat narco-terrorism and how to be in solidarity with black people in North America, because in South America, they did not give up their claim for the land. In this country, so many families like my family were chased off the land because of racial terrorism, because of exclusionary lending policies, because of redlining, because of urban renewal. We're talking about a series of losses, a series of disconnections to land. And so even more than a conversation about how do we organize ourselves, the discussion of how do we recenter an agenda on space and land is paramount, because what we're seeing is more than half of the discussion being about getting a job, or being about a quote unquote conversation on diversity or even inclusion, which are laudable. But for me, Jamal, I think what the learning is from black nationalists and what continues to be is an opportunity to refocus. And we can absolutely have a conversation and a critique, and we should, about how do we even come together to think about gender equity, to think about what it means to have a more open discussion about leadership, about hierarchy, about who gets to be at the table. But without a discussion about space and land, we're losing our ability to actually have a slam dunk and a victory. So a much bigger conversation. And for me, this generation of folks who are organizing and demanding more action and demanding more justice in terms of who gets to be a leader, in terms of how leadership is even defined in a movement context, is the lesson. And it's definitely a lesson that I want to learn from too.
Thank you.
You know, could I, and I just end with this and I'm out of here.
Okay.
I would like to facilitate an introduction between you and one of my greatest mentors and elders who now passed away, Chokwe Lumumba.
Amazing.
His son is right now the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you already know him?
I don't, not personally, but I know who he is, and I have been in a room with him and heard him speak, and I know what he's about, and it's phenomenal. I would love the introduction.
Yeah, absolutely, because that camp right there, I'm probably one of the few black men in the city who, claims black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. And his father, Turquay was one of my mentors and one of the architects of one of the greatest black nationalist movements, the Republic of New Africa, which was, an attempt to actually gain the 5 lower states. And that's an undertold story, unfortunately. But the Republic of New Africa, got to give them enough props. And so if I can facilitate that introduction, I'm on it.
That'd be great, Jamal. Thank you for calling, my man.
you.
We have another
Y'all have a
caller.
good morning.
You do
Thanks.
too. Caller, you're live on Boston Black News.
Oh, thank you very much. I know you're talking about building wealth in the black community today, and one of the things I've learned is that one of the ways a lot of white families have been able to build wealth is by owning homes. And Richard Rothstein, in his book, The Color of Law, describes in excruciating detail how black families were denied that opportunity, really primarily after World War II through today. And one of the recommendations he makes is that black families should be allowed to buy a house. For instance, he uses the example of Levittown, which in 1950 cost, $9,000. And in today, with normal inflation, might cost, I think in the book he said, $175,000, which is probably, I'm sure, way less than the actual cost today of that suburban house. For example, in Levittown, it's probably closer to 500 or 600,000. And I was just wondering what you think of that recommendation as a way to build wealth among black families and as a way to repair the wrong that was done for, and probably continues to be done for so many years.
Thank you, Michael.
What do you think of that?
No, it's a great question, and it's definitely a topic of quite a bit of debate. So I have been in the conversation with the Boston Federal Reserve Bank for the last probably 3 years almost now to revisit the Color of Wealth report that we know was released in 2017. Amazing. So we know that study really put on the map for us here in Boston the discrepancies in wealth between black and white and Latinx families in particular. And one of the findings that's from a national study suggests that a white family in the United States has about 8 times the wealth of a black family and 5 times the wealth of a Latinx family. And so those divides are significant. And as you suggest and rightly note, many researchers around the country point to the fact that most families who do have wealth in this country find that it's based in home ownership. So that becomes a really important front door for building generational wealth. Not without a critique, however. So what we do know from even the mortgage foreclosure crisis of 2008 and also ongoing issues with lending practices around the country, that even for people who do own their homes, there's no guarantee of wealth generation for themselves or for their families. And so there has to be a larger strategy. But you're right in calling out access to home ownership as a very important lever for what has to be a broader set of strategies. And so I think where that leaves us is a longer term consideration of asset building. And for me, I would also point to the need for a broader understanding of what wealth actually is. And so we have had a conversation that has been very much defined by financial experts, even the Federal Reserve Bank and economists, that have told us that wealth has to do with what your assets are, with kind of money in the bank or what's in your financial portfolio. But it's really important for myself and those of us that are in wealth building communities to recognize that our history, our stories, our experiences are an incredible source of wealth, an incredible source of how we can build strategies for the future that are more long term. So sorry to give you more of a metaphysical answer, but it has to be both and, because unfortunately wealth conversations, even like the ones that are generated by the Boston Federal Reserve Bank, can inadvertently reinforce a deficit narrative about what we don't have, what we can't do, and what we need to do is get a whole lot of money. And sure, more money can be a good thing, but not without a real understanding of who we are and where we come from along with that, because I'm not for having that just be defined by someone who is not us.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's talk about the hackathon and lookbooks series for equity, because we had Keena here last a
So
couple of weeks.
great,
Oh,
yes.
she was awesome.
So
Came in with all
great.
that energy.
Yes,
and
amazing,
it's an exciting
amazing. My
project.
hero.
I'm telling you, it's incredible.
Well, Reverend Ron, we're so fortunate to have you on board on this project with me, to be
Right.
learning from you and so much of the work that you've done for years and years and years for your career, which is about helping people understand that we have the tools that we need to build the futures that we deserve.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And so this larger project that I've been building for the last 3 years is called Hacking the Archive.
Right.
And essentially what it is, or I should say even what a hack is, because people may or may
Right.
not know
Right.
what that is. And what a hack is, and you may know it from seeing people in competitions or engineers hacking something. It's not the negative sense of hacking your bank card or hacking your identity. It's taking this idea into something that is about opening up possibilities for a creative solution.
Right.
So how do you think about solving a problem that hasn't been solved, or how do you think about a better solution for solving a problem in a new way? That's a hack.
Right.
And a hackathon is just a sort of a moment of people coming together to find a solution, a new idea for approaching a big problem. So this project, Hacking the Archive, starts with a little bit of the discussion that we were having earlier, which is looking at this incredible generation of folks who were so active in the 60s and so dedicated and have given us so many of the gifts, the blessings and the benefits of this moment of 2023,
Right.
whether they were stopping a highway or they were advocating for women's rights or they were, arguing against overreach of government in war abroad, like in Vietnam.
Right.
That generation has sat before us with incredible visions and strategies, and yet they're older. Right. So we have folks who are in their 70s and 80s right now who we can and should learn from, because those issues around space, around planning, around jobs, around education, around housing are as urgent as ever.
Right.
So we start with this idea that, one, we have to recognize our stories and ourselves, and some of the papers and files and photos we have at home as our archives, as
Right.
our wealth. And how can we lean into those things, literally hack into them for new ideas and solutions about the future?
Right.
So Hacking the Archive, that is our mission. And it's really a coming together of activists, of archivists, of students, of faith-based leaders like yourself, of community-based and nonprofit leaders coming together around big questions. And so we have a series of partners, including Bishop Borders at Morning Star Baptist Church, Reverend Mary Margaret at the First Church of Roxbury, folks from the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, DSNI is in the mix, Abergal from Teen Empowerment is in the mix. And each partner for us is asking a very big question that they have and they care about as it relates to the racial wealth gap and closing it.
Right.
And so what we'll do is we'll take all those questions and lots of information from the archives at MIT, where I am, archives at Harvard, archives from Northeastern University, from Boston University, from UMass Boston, from all these places, and we'll bring that content together in a room on a Saturday. And we'll invite people from the public and students and residents and anyone else. And we'll say, here's some information. Here's some big questions. Help us answer these questions today.
Wow.
And so for 8 hours, with lots of snacks and Mountain Dew and maybe some Doritos, some
Right.
spicy ones. I like those.
Right.
People will really try to ask big questions about the racial wealth gap.
Right.
And the questions that are in service, not to just research to sit on the shelf or to people like me who write books and papers, but asking these questions in service to communities, because the questions actually, I should say, they're answering the questions, but the questions have been generated by residents, by leaders in the neighborhoods. And so this is our way of sort of flipping the academic or even flipping the MIT model, which is you have a solitary researcher like me who has a question. What is the answer to X, right? I'd ask a question and then I would go to talk to people or I would go to a library and try to figure out the question. This flips that.
Right.
In this instance, it's the community that's asking institutions the question. This is what we want to find out. Help us. Help
Right.
bring in other people. So the hackathon is what that is about. And the vision is to really look back 50 years and to see, what have we done? What have we learned? What have been our strategies? What have been our legacy? How can we look back 50 years so we can look forward for the next 50 years?
Right.
And so this project is imagined as a 100-year study of really naming and claiming our wealth and using that to create and generate the kind of future that we deserve now and that our young people and our children certainly deserve. So the voice of youth is very much at the center of this.
That's
and so,
awesome.
as you know, we just had this online Know Yourself, Know Your Wealth challenge for
Right.
young people in the city, and it was spectacular.
Awesome.
Young people from ages 14 to 18 were asked to submit their understanding, their definition of wealth. What does wealth mean to you? And to provide some kind of a media or artistic expression of that. So we got young people dancing in videos, we got poems, we got beats that were mixed, drawings, paintings, all kinds of visions that were really thrilling. And it was a competition.
Right.
So everyone got something, which was great. Thank you, Amazon. Gift cards all day. But they
Right.
also were able to win additional prizes to give them visibility and recognition. And so for us, the idea of wealth is bigger than dollars and cents.
Right.
And it really sits in our young people who are truly our wealth. And we want to make sure to be centering on what they see and what they need as we, again, are leaning into this vision of generational wealth building. So it's very much about sharing ideas, sharing history, and making sure that it has a cross-generational focus, and making sure that it is so much grounded in a more expansive notion of wealth that we can really build on, because that's everything. You know,
Right.
this is how I got here,
Right.
which is people like you and people like Pastor Wall, who maybe didn't even know me, but you poured into a vision for me.
Right.
And so that's what we have to keep going, because that is what our young people need and their families need for their safety, for their well-being, for their equity.
Right. We have a caller live on Boston Black News. Caller.
Good morning, Ron. Good morning, Dr. Carolyn. How are you?
Who is this? Who is this? Do I know that voice?
Yes, you do.
It's Priscilla.
Oh,
How
I
are
knew
you?
that was you, Sister Priscilla. I just had to make sure. How you feel today?
I feel good. I'm so glad to hear your voice and see you on Boston Black News.
It's so good. I'm looking for you. I feel like I'm in your house. I'm looking for you left and right. So you showed up on the phone. That's good for my spirit.
Listen, I'm listening to you and I just think it's wonderful. You know, I love you. I love the work
Oh,
that
you're
you're
so
doing
wonderful. Thank you.
at MIT. My question is that you are on the Governor's Advisory Council, correct?
Correct.
And I wanted to know what the mandate is. Like, what is the mission of that advisory? Because I believe I know mostly everybody on that advisory committee, and I'm just wondering because I know that the former governor had an advisory committee too, and I just want to know what is the purpose, what is the mission, what are you all mandated to do? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sister Priscilla. I appreciate the call and the question. So you are correct. Yeah, I am a member of the Governor's Council on Black Empowerment that is co-chaired by Tanisha Sullivan and Tony Richards. So it's essentially a body of folks, and it sounds like you have lots of experience with this and know about the previous iteration of it. But essentially, it is Governor Healy bringing people together to advise her, and actually, the council is in a moment of agenda setting right now based on what leaders are defining as priorities. And so you're catching me out there a little bit because I had a conflict and wasn't able to go to the meeting that was this week because I had a faculty commitment. But it is a moment of very serious agenda setting according to several different outcomes, including education, health and wellness, and also economic empowerment. So this is a moment for leaders across the state. It's a statewide body, clearly, but it does have representation beyond Boston, which is so important to me, actually. And folks are coming to the governor with their priorities and really leaning in, particularly on some of the budget issues that are set before them, but also trying to think long term about what the governor and certainly the lieutenant governor can and should do this year and moving forward. So those are broad terms for you, but this is the moment of agenda setting. Is there anything in particular that you'd want to raise since you're on the air right now that you want to just put in my ear that I can carry for you?
Well, you know what my pet peeve is, Dr. Fallon, about the construction, the procurement, the lack of. I don't know if you know, I am on the Boston Employment Commission.
Yes, I do.
And,
that's such good news.
So that's still a major issue, and it's funny because before the governor was the governor, when she was still the Attorney General, we were meeting about the Boston resident job policy and how we could do things better, even on the state level, as far as equity and enforcement, and about us getting more jobs. And it just seems like it's gotten worse, the non-compliance.
Yeah.
And so that is definitely something that I would like to see raised. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priscilla, because we
Thank
got
you,
like
Sister
30
Priscilla.
seconds left.
I know.
And we're going to be able, I knew you'll be able to talk to Dr.
Okay,
Crockett
let's talk
afterwards,
some more, but
okay?
that stuff's near and dear to my heart too, so I hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Dr.
Thank you,
Crockett,
Ron.
thank you for coming by.
We're done.
We're
Oh,
done.
no.
It's an hour.
It was
It went
so
by that
good.
quick. Happy
Thank
Women's
you.
Month to
Oh, thanks,
everyone.
everyone. This is fantastic.
This has been really good. You got to come back.
Gotta come
You're
back.
right down the street.
Thanks so much. Thank you again, Reverend Ron, and thank you.
Yep. We'll be right back.
Vince, I'm so happy to be here. Such an honor.
When I think of, all the accolades, I'm not even going to go into the bio right now, but it's just like incredible. The book you wrote, People Before Highways.
Coming up next will be the Manual broadcast.
Right before I hit the ground, a man with a big hand caught me. And I told her I couldn't see his face because it was so bright. But I heard a voice that said, do you want to go home with your mom or come with me? And I looked up and I said, I want my mom. He said, okay, this time you're going with her, next time you're coming with me. 4 years old. I said, wait, excuse me, sir, what is your name? He didn't say my name was Buddha. He didn't say my name was Muhammad. But he looked back at me 28 years ago and said, son, my name is Jesus. I don't need everybody, but if I can get about 200,000 worshipers that knew that there was still resurrection power in the blood of Jesus, lift up your hands and worship our God right now. Hey! You're worthy, Jesus. You're faithful, Jesus. You're holy, Jesus. You're alive. You are powerful. You're consistent. You never fail, never fail, never fail, never fail. Say, on the hill. There is blood for me. Say, on the hill. You're not too far. You're not too low. God still loves you. God still wants you. Say, on the hill. On the hill there's a cross. On the cross there is blood for me. Come on, blood for me. For me. On the hill. On the hill there's a cross. On the cross there is blood for me. I need you to take the next 20 seconds and give God the best worship you can. Right now, let's go. We thank you for we love you, Jesus. Say, on the hill. Say, on the hill, there's a cross. Say, on the cross, there is blood for me. For me. For me. Come on, let them sing. On the hill. blood for me. One more time. On the hill. Hey. Blood is flowing now. His blood is flowing now. If you're sick in your body, I want to invite you to lift your hands in this moment. There's enough blood to heal you. By his stripes you are healed. By his stripes you are healed.